All right, Nathan, how do you say your last name?
Error, just like...
Error? Okay.
Yeah, just like NS Error, except it's spelled differently.
Your middle initial's S, right?
I wish. I've considered getting it legally changed.
Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 27 of the iPhreaks show. This week on our panel we have Ben Sherman.
Hello from Houston, eagerly awaiting the iPad event.
Andrew Madsen.
Hi from Salt Lake City, and I don't get to buy anything today.
Jaim Zuber.
Hello from Minneapolis.
Rod Schmidt.
Merry Christmas from Salt Lake City.
I'm Charles Max Wood from DevChat.tv, and this week we have two special guests. We have Kyle Richter.
Good morning from Key West.
And do you prefer Nate or Nathan?
Either one.
Nathan,
it's up to you.
Nathan Eror.
Hello, I'm also in Houston.
All right. Do you guys want to do a brief introduction since you haven't been on the show before?
Sure, we can do that. My name is Kyle Richter. I'm the co-founder of Empirical Development.
And I'm Nathan Eror, and I am the game development lead for Empirical Development.
Awesome. So nobody plays games on their iOS device, so I'm not quite sure why we have you here.
No, it's a passing fad for sure. I suspect that it'll just be over in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Once they get hardware controllers, they're really going to ruin it.
Do you think that's going to be a thing?
Yeah, they announced it at DubDub that you'll be able to get like sort of a Nintendo like shrink-wrapped controller on top of the iPhone. I'm still waiting for one of those to come out. I want to play with one.
Logitech just released their print ad a couple of weeks ago for their first one, and mysteriously it shows empty hands holding an iPhone saying something's missing.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
I don't know if they got the irony of that.
There is a second one, and the name is escaping me at the moment, that there actually are pictures of. But yeah, they're starting to come out now, and I think it's going to be a big deal just because of the Apple TV. I think the Apple TV is a much bigger deal than people are letting on. I know Kyle agrees with me.
Do you think they're ever going to open up the Apple TV for developers?
Well, I have a theory on what's going to happen there, and I don't think they need to open it up. With AirPlay, if you keep the price of the Apple TV down to $99 and use AirPlay to use it as a next-gen gaming console, you don't really have to do anything. The big problem that we have is with no tactile feedback on the iPhone, you can't see what you're tapping on the iPhone while playing a game on the Apple TV. But with the game controllers, you would be able to do that now. So you kind of have a game controller in your pocket that has a GPU on it that you hook up to any Apple TV and start playing instantly.
I wonder about the lag, though. Because what was that game? Real Racing, was it? That they demoed live where you could have like 4 people racing at the same time on the same Apple TV. And we tried that at the office, and just with 2 people. And the lag was enough to make me not want to do it again.
Yeah, definitely the lag's the last piece of the puzzle that they need. The game controllers were the big hardware problem. But in theory, it's all on the LAN. It should be super fast. The Wi-Fi pipes are more than big enough to carry the video. It's just a matter of optimizing the Apple TV away from being designed to stream video, where second lag didn't really matter, to something that's designed to handle interactive games, where they have to really get that lag time up.
Yeah, latency is always going to be the issue, especially with games. I mean, everyone expects their 60 frames per second, and for good reason. But it's getting better, and it's already a lot better than it was when that first announcement was made. I'm assuming, especially with as a lot of things in the game world, this stuff kind of takes time, right? We kind of wait for technology to catch up to where we want it to be, and I think. Apple's already pushing the 802.11ac standard, and that's going to be a few years down the road before we see that in Apple TVs and iOS devices. But the storm is coming.
So for right now, what generally is your approach to building games on the iOS platform?
I'll let Nathan field that one since he's kind of in charge of that for the company.
Yeah, sorry, I had my mute there. It really depends on the type of game, right? There are multiple different approaches you can take. Is it, is it a 3D game? Is it a 2D game? Is it, an action-packed fast twitch kind of game? Is it more of an RPG? Is it none of those and something more like trivia or a word game? Depending on the type of game it is, will kind of help decide part of your process. First of all, what tools do you use? You go straight up Objective-C and use UIKit. I mean, yes, probably if it's a word game, unless you're Lauren Brichter, or if it's a trivia game or something like that. But if it's a 2D game, maybe you hop on the new hotness in iOS 7 and use Sprite Kit, and that kind of while Sprite Kit is really cool, it definitely has some of its own limitations. And so the first thing to decide is what tools to use. 3D game, do you want to use a 3D engine like Unity, which most likely you want to use some type of engine for a 3D game rather than building your own, just because that's a pretty complex process and you'd waste all of your time building the engine and not actually make a fun game. So do you use the Unity engine or Unreal's UDK or some of the other third-party engines, pretty much at this point, all of the good 3D engines are all commercial. The open source ones have kind of died off because the commercial ones have gotten pretty cheap, licensing wise. But for 2D, there's Coco's 2D, and then of course there's now Apple's Sprite Kit, and you can even do quite a bit. And I've done this built, with UIKit. There's no reason to do it now because the physics engine, even though it is in UIKit, using Sprite Kit is so easy. There's really no reason to use UIKit's physics engine for a game, but you probably could. So, long story short, first you have to decide what kind of game it is, and you need to decide 2D, 3D, which platforms you're going to be on. Because as one advantage you have building a game is, and this can be looked at as an advantage or a disadvantage, is games are expected to have very different and unique UIs compared to any other standard app. Right, they're expected to be very custom, and so it's much easier to design a game to be cross-platform than it is to design, an app to be cross-platform, because you're most likely not going to be using most of the system UI APIs. In a lot of cases, it's just an OpenGL view, and that's really the only view you would use from the system. Everything else is custom. So, so if you're going cross-platform, then you need to decide: are you going to do that all by yourself? Or are you going to use a cross-platform engine like Unity? So it really comes down to deciding what you want, where you want the game to be, and how you want it to look. And then from there, it's not much different than standard development. I mean, it's just software with a slightly different approach.
I don't know enough about game development to really know what all goes into it. How much of it is artwork versus how much of it is programming?
At least 50-50. The artwork is extremely important, obviously. And then and it's not just, your standard, flat 2D or, image PNG assets sometimes. I mean, often games have, characters, whether they're humanoid or not, that have some type of animation, and that animation is often, pre-built and pre-canned, like a character running and jumping and throwing, those kinds of things. Those kinds of animations are usually pre-built by an artist and brought into the game. So there's definitely a lot. And then there's also audio, of course, not just background music, but also environmental audio, whether it's the background, like there's atmospheric audio, there's also music. So atmospheric audio would be like, birds chirping and stuff like that. Then there's music, and then there's also sound effects, which, could be, people getting punched or dying or, whatever they might be. So there's a lot of different creative assets that go in as well, both audio and visual. And I think and art and sound are at least half of the work, if not more, in building a game. So the art is different, right? There's the design, the way you build the art is different. The way you package the art is different. And if you're doing, animations, there are multiple ways of doing that. You can have an artist pre-build the animations into keyframes, and you pre-render them and just play them. Or you can, use more use like inverse kinematic animation kind of stuff, whereas humanoid animations, which are built in in another tool, something like Maya or 3ds Max or something like that by an artist, which then you play in your engine. So yeah, art is at least half of it, and it does require having a good artist with a knowledge of production art to really, especially if you're doing a 3D game. 2D games you can get away with a little less kind of game development knowledge because you're mostly just building, 2D images, just PNGs that you build in Photoshop. So.
Yeah, it goes without saying that Tetris is obviously going to be a lot more development than art, whereas something like Infinity Blade 2 is probably more art time than development time. So it depends on what type of game you're looking at. I mean, there are very simplistic artwork games like I don't want to say Letterpress is a simplistic game, but the artwork for it is not as in depth as a first person shooter would be.
Doodle Jump.
Yeah, Infinity Blade is just UI gesture recognizer played on top of a movie, right?
it almost seems like it's that old Myth type game where it's just animating through the still movies, that old style they used to do. Bloodbath was an old Mac game that did that, where it was it's a original first person single point shooter. And it was just, masked images of movies of things popping up and getting shot and popping back down. So sometimes it feels like we're going back to that world on iOS.
Like Dragon's Lair.
Yeah, like Dragon's Lair, absolutely.
Oh, man. Yeah, just old pre-canned stuff, old arcade stuff is... even those animations in Mortal Kombat, that was only partially interactive, right? Those animations are all pre-canned, like people. It's really strange to look back at it now, but it's still kind of cool.
Yeah, especially the complex fatality stuff in Mortal Kombat. Yeah. It's all just masked videos.
And we both mentioned Letterpress a couple times now, and you mentioned it from an art perspective. I don't know this for sure because I haven't actually talked to Lauren, but I get the impression that there's actually no art in Letterpress other than like the icon. It looks like it's all, by no art, I mean, like PNG resources and stuff like that. There's virtually none in there. It's all fonts and all rendered on the fly. So, that's almost like a no art game compared, like you said, to Infinity Blade, which is probably at least 3/4 of the work we're doing art and animations.
Now, Nathan, you brought up an interesting point there about Letterpress. I actually I have a copy of the IPA on my computer, and I just dropped it into Slender, which can actually reverse compile out the assets. You're entirely correct. There's only 18 assets inside the project for a total of 232 kilobytes, so it's almost all completely rendered in code.
Yeah,
this
I got that feeling.
So perfect, it's almost like it was rehearsed.
Yeah, it's
I was actually doing that exact thing, except with a different tool. Not a different tool like for pay, but like just the App Crush script that can unpack the IPAs for you.
It's one of my favorite little hidden features of Slender. I like to see how other people built their app. So we tossed it in kind of last minute, and it's always really neat to kind of toss an app in and see what can happen. It also really upsets other developers when I email them and say, "Hey, you can save 27% of the download speed off Angry Birds if you remove these duplicate images." So it definitely gets me in some trouble sometimes.
So one of the holdups I would have, I think I have probably set a record somewhere for like most game programming books purchased and read without ever producing a single game. I'm like fascinated by the topic in general, but just kind of whenever I would get started, I would always get hung up on something. Like one of them was like there were no good game engines way back in the day, so you would always start by writing your own game loop, and a lot of that stuff is solved. And now it seems like the problem is lack of artwork. Since I'm not a designer, I would have to either just get some like sprite sheets that are freely available on the internet, and then you can't really ship with those. I'm wondering, like, what are the challenges that you guys see with building a game? Is it artwork or is it something else?
Well, I think because we're all developers, artwork seems to be the big problem for us. I think most developers, and I'm sure I'm going to get some backlash on this, we started being developers because we wanted to make video games, because they're the most interesting thing on the computers when we were growing up with them. Is, I want to make games too. I want to make a game just for myself. And I think we all had that experience when we first started kind of playing around with games. Is, I can't draw. So I have a bunch of stick figures running across the screen, and it's really not interesting. So what a lot of people have done is, a single developer partner up with a single designer, and they'll produce, a world-class game. And that's really what you need to do if you want to be that one-man shop with a game like that. Not a lot of developers have that artistic talent, and not a lot of really talented artists have that developer talent. So it's really kind of a partnership you have to form. I mean, the amount of developers that can do game art and make it look really good, I think I can count on one hand that I've met.
How do you learn how to kind of speak designer as a developer?
Practicing a lot of practice and a lot of trial and error. They have a completely different mindset, and especially getting an artist who hasn't done games before. It's like getting an artist who hasn't done an app before. They don't understand how things need to be sliced up. They don't understand how things need to be presented, and they might be able to do some really cool concept art, but it just doesn't work in the real world. Nathan's working on a game project with us right now where the artist will design these beautiful mock-ups for the iPhone screen, and it's kind of a first-person 2D scrolling game like Mario, and the artwork doesn't really lend itself to that kind of scrolling behavior. It's not something that can be continuous, so it definitely raises a lot of problems for the artist, and it takes a long time for them to learn what goes into a game as well. Because when you're playing a game, you don't really think about all the pieces that have to be put in there together, even from an artwork perspective, which is very visible to us as opposed to the code. So it's definitely a lot of trial and error. If you're working with an artist who's never done a game before, it's definitely a lot of back and forth and arguing.
Yeah, there's really a very strict delineation between, and a big difference between concept art and production art in a game. Like if you're an artist concepting out like an app, a regular non-game app in Photoshop, a large percentage of what you do in Photoshop can easily be translated directly into the app. Where in a game, when you concept out stuff, because a game is a continuously moving simulation, right? So, there's very little static content. The screens don't just stop in a spot. Things are always moving, and hopefully at least 60 times a second, your world is being simulated. And so, the art that you design as a concept, while it might look great, requires a completely different set of skills to turn into production art. Like if you have a background, if it's a 2D game, and so you have a background landscape, that landscape needs to be repeatable in some way. You need to be able, so if you're going to be moving side to side, we're talking about moving side to side in 2D, for example, and you have a landscape in the background, then as the character moves, you have to be able to repeat that landscape, right? So each edge of the image have to be, perfectly tileable, and there are things like that you need to consider when doing production art. And it's a different skill. It's not as creative, I guess, as doing concept art would be. So it's also difficult to tug artists in that direction sometimes. There's some that really like to do production art, and in a lot of cases, just out of pure necessity, I've become pretty decent with Photoshop, just out of necessity to turn concept art into something I can actually use in a real game.
Nathan touched on an interesting point there, and it's tileable art, which is kind of the bane of our existence when doing game dev, is you have a very limited amount of VRAM, which stores the textures in it, the actual artwork. So you really want to try to cut down on that and make everything as repeatable as possible. And the people doing the concept art, they don't think in terms like that. They'll think, let me hand you a sky map that's 8 megabytes, and it doesn't really tile at all. So you have to kind of fight that battle as well.
Yeah, and you run into multiple different issues depending on what type of game it is, right? If some of these issues some of them are optimization issues. some of the background stuff can be an optimization issue, especially, if it's a standard kind of platformer game where you're designing the levels, a game designer is designing the levels manually. But if it's a procedurally generated game, then there are all kinds of other issues that get thrown in there, that you need to, if it's not procedurally generated, then you can hand tweak the levels, even with some of the repeating backgrounds and stuff. If there's like a little quirk somewhere, you can hide that quirk, by putting something else on top of it. But if you're doing things procedurally, it's a lot more difficult to find those quirks until you actually run the game. So there's a lot of import the art, code what I need, run it, tweak a little bit, stop it, tweak a little bit, run it, tweak a little bit. And I'd say as a developer or a game designer, that last kind of 20%, of the game development, that tweaking part is actually a lot more than 20%. I spend probably more time tweaking float values or sizes of things than I do actually writing code, it feels like sometimes, just because you never know what's going to feel right. And that's a really important concept to get across in game development, that one of probably the best things you can do if you're starting to build a game and you've never done it before, probably one of the best things you can do for yourself and for your game is to get to a working prototype as quickly as possible and play it. At least you can play it, because then you'll know very quickly whether or not it's fun. Is the concept not going to be fun? Is just my implementation not going to be fun? Or do I just need to tweak it a little bit? And then get into the hands of other people and get feedback from them as well, and hopefully actually watch them play it over their shoulder. But it's really, really important in a game to get something up and running as quickly as possible, because really what makes a game fun isn't the initial concept as much as it is the feel of a game, especially an action type of game. Getting that exact right value for your player's mass, so when he jumps, he jumps at the right pace, and so. All those kinds of things, getting that exact right number. It could be, the difference between 5.01 and 5.015 for a value. You just don't know. You have to tweak until you get it right. And I won't even get into the differences between hardware making that a problem. But the cool thing about developing a game from that perspective is it's just as much of an art as it is, pure engineering. Even as an engineer, you're spending a lot of time kind of tweaking the feel of things, at least if you're an indie. If you're in a big AAA shop, you're coding a part of the engine and that's it. But if you're, doing it on a small team, then everyone is constantly running and tweaking and changing values, and everyone becomes a designer and has a lot of creative say in the game at that point. And that's when it gets really fun. And
do you end up having to, just because that feedback cycle of you're tweaking some multiplication factor for some mass, acceleration and gravity and whatever, in order to make the game feel right, and you switch this value around and rebuild and run to that port of the game where you can jump up on the ledge and make sure it feels right. Do you ever do things like embed those controls within your game in a dev build so you can tweak those settings?
Absolutely. This is where tools become really important. Something that every game developer I know loves to do is to build tools. Pretty much every game project I've ever been on has had at least one custom tool of some kind to make the process easier. And then there are things built into the engines that help with that kind of stuff as well. We use Unity for a lot of our games, the Unity 3D engine, not only because it's cross-platform, but also because the Unity editor is a really good environment for that. You can actually run the game. You can actually just hit Command P or press the play button, and your game executes immediately inside of the editor, and you can tweak the values while it's running and get some of that feel. Although it's not the same as running it on a device, it kind of gets you part of the way there. And then yes, one of the other things you want to get in the game as quickly as possible is a way to tweak those values when it's running on a device. Whether that's a developer console that pops up, or I've done just open up a basic telnet session over TCP and send commands. I've even seen games, I haven't done this myself, but I've seen people go as far as to embed an HTTP server directly into the debug build, so they can send HTTP requests and have a little, pop open the browser so they can tweak values in the browser while they're running the game.
That's awesome. It's almost like a remote HTTP quick console.
Yeah, that's exactly. Another thing you can do is use the debugger for that, obviously, but having something where you especially, in the case like in Empirical, for example, our team is distributed, so it's really nice if I can get to all the guys on the team and give them a way to pop open a developer console, change some values, and then the changes they make can be sent back to me in some way, or one of the developers to change things up. And yeah, so that tweaking, that'd be the other thing you want to get as quickly as possible, is to get the thing running, and so you can start tweaking the feel. And yeah, to really shorten that build run cycle, even if it's just a configuration file that you can, that doesn't work as well on iOS, obviously. But if you're working on a Mac or something, just changing some values in a configuration file really quickly, and it can also make it easy. And then also having ways to get to those levels, right? So if you're tweaking something that only happens
straight to it, yeah,
right, yeah. If you're tweaking something that only happens in a certain part of a certain level, find ways to warp to that part and get everything set up properly. So you'll definitely find game developers spend a good portion of their time. I'd say a third, maybe even more of their time building tools to make the actual process easier and more fruitful. Because the whole goal, right, is to get a fun game. And discovering that, and you don't really design a fun game as much as you kind of discover a fun game. You definitely have some ideas of what you think might be fun, and you put things together in a way that hopefully will be fun. But the final product is never what the original thought was, the original design was. It's really, you kind of discover it through tweaking and testing and getting in front of other people and that kind of stuff.
What you guys are talking about here is actually where cheat codes came from. The developers of early on games entered cheat codes into games not to cheat, but so they could test stuff, jump the levels, unlock weapons, all that kind of stuff. And, they just started eventually leaving them turned on and in the game, and they became cheat codes as we know them. So it's definitely not a new concept or anything like that, allowing developers to kind of cheat their way through a game. But it's been with us since really the beginning of video gaming.
So I want to go back to something you said earlier about the sort of scrolling, side-scrolling games. I did a game development session at a conference, and as a result of it, I wanted to have like a cool game demo, so I downloaded the Metroid sprites, which was really freaking awesome. So you had like the Samus running around, and I could tap the screen to make her jump, and she would do the flip animation and then continue running. But it was an endless scroller, kind of like Cannabalt or Temple Run, right? And one thing I noticed is, so I had this ground texture that was like, I don't know, twice the screen width, and I would move it I would just move it underneath her and keep the player stationary, right? And then when it got sufficiently far off screen, I would, deallocate that particular ground texture and allocate a new one, far up in the future, and it gave you this illusion that you were running on ground forever. But what I noticed is that the dealloc and the realloc of the new class, the new object, even though I was using the same texture, that was a perceptible hiccup in the animation. And so what I ended up doing is just recycling it exactly how you would recycle table view cells. And I'm wondering, this sort of mindset shift that you have like very little time to do your work. What techniques do you tend to use, or what things do you stay away from inside of your game loop to avoid things like this?
So the really interesting thing with game development is, unlike a normal app, you're rendering the entire game loop, the entire scene, 60 or so times a second. So optimization really comes into play a lot more than it comes into with a normal app. So even shaving off a couple of milliseconds for a call or OpenGL reset identity can make a really big difference. Nathan, I'm sure you have some particular optimizations that you like to use over and over again.
Yeah, there are a lot of standard things. The recycling thing is very common. I mean, and like Kyle said, if you want your game to render at 60 frames per second, then everything, including all the other overhead required to render, not just your calculations that you need to do, but every bit of overhead, from sending textures across to the GPU and all that kind of stuff to actually finally blit the final image on screen, you have 0.017 seconds to do all of that. And you have to do it consistently in under 0.017 seconds, or your game will hiccup. You'll drop frames. So yeah, there are a ton of optimizations. First, you hit on one of them, and that's reuse. Allocating on pretty much any platform malloc is slow. Allocating memory is slow. And so it doesn't really matter what engine, what platform you're on, pre-allocating stuff as you need a lot. So something you'll hear especially game developers that come from the console world. I did my console time back in the PS2 and GameCube days, and it hasn't really changed since then from what I understand. Something that you'll hear console developers complain about when they move to something like the iPhone is virtual memory, right? As a console developer, like on a PlayStation or something like that, you're given a block of memory. You know exactly how big that block of memory is, and it's always yours for the entire run of your game, right? And you can allocate however you want. You can use that memory however you want, but it's yours, and nothing's going to get swapped anywhere. That's your memory. Obviously, you don't get that on iOS. You're, forced to use the whole virtual memory system, which can occasionally be fraught with peril if you don't use it carefully. And so, like what a lot of game developers will do, and I do this too in most of the games I build, is to pre-allocate everything. That whole launch cycle, the loading is, load as much stuff in advance as possible, right? Get to that first launch screen as quickly as you can, but while they're picking through the menu, you should be loading everything else. Because if you need to allocate a lot of objects during the execution of a run loop, it's not something you think about too often, when you're building a regular app. But really every line of code that you write is all going to be put together and going to be run all at the same time, and it all has to run in under 0.017 seconds. So that little bit of overhead it takes to allocate and init an object is going to cause a lot of trouble. So pre-allocating things and just kind of keeping them off to the side, so kind of building things up in memory, but not necessarily rendering them, because you don't want to necessarily things that aren't. Let's move to the next thing. So pre-allocating, setting things up and not doing any kind of allocating during the run of the app is as important as possible. Strategically using the stack versus the heap, and then the next thing would be only rendering what's necessary, right? So now we're talking about iOS here, so I'll take some very iOS specific approaches. But the iOS GPU is a tile-based renderer, and it works best when it can decide when it knows exactly what to do on each for each pixel, right? So when I'm trying to think of a better way of saying this. So when you render a scene to the screen, and this is even true in UIKit, what's going on in the background is every pixel that needs to be rendered, you need to decide what color that pixel is going to be for that particular frame, right? So if you're rendering a game, say, and you have multiple layers on top of other layers, if one of those layers is being obscured, or so you have, say, 10 layers deep of something, right? And you have to render each layer before you get to the final one. That's a lot of overhead. That's called an overdraw in the game world. So, for example, that's where the whole transparency issue becomes a big deal. And that's something, if you've done any work with scroll views and table views and that kind of stuff, you've probably dealt with opacity and transparency, because similar issues when you're trying to scroll a table view real fast at 60 frames per second, you want to give the GPU as little to do as possible, right? So if you have 10 layers of things where they all could potentially be transparent because they have an alpha value, then each of those need to be rendered in succession, and then you blend on top of them. But if you can do things like, if you know, for example, something is going to be completely opaque, then flag it as opaque, and then you don't need to worry about rendering anything underneath it. The renderer in the GPUs is very smart at very intelligent at deciding, this thing's opaque, so I don't need to worry about even trying to draw anything behind it. The GPU won't even call the shaders to get that pixel. It'll just grab the first one. That's kind of what it's built for. And then, go ahead.
I have a quick question. Maybe not so quick, but I was at a really good presentation by Jonathan Bloxham at CocoConf, and he was talking about just sort of the lay of the land of all the graphics technologies available on Mac and iOS, and how we have SceneKit and Sprite Kit, and we have GLKit, and I was looking specifically at, I can't remember which one it was actually now. I think it was SceneKit, where you can do a lot of things without necessarily knowing about like vertex shaders and pixel shaders and all the stuff in what is it, OpenGL ES 2.0.
Right.
And those are things that, since I'm kind of old school, I learned way before shaders existed. And so I'm happy to take on these sort of higher level abstractions. I'm wondering if those things like make sense to build on top of those things, or do you find yourself like wanting to drop down into these lower levels?
No, absolutely. It's and that's actually kind of it kind of cuts both ways there, because you can do a lot just using those technologies. And, most of the stuff you're going to do in, vertex and fragment shaders is the same stuff over and over again, right? Because, a lot of the stuff you learned when you were doing fixed function in GL, which I also did back in the late 90s, before there was a shader language. Even a lot of the stuff you would do in that part of the pipeline, the rendering part of the pipeline, is just replicated in shaders anyways. There's a lot of standard shaders that basically do what you would have done in the fixed function pipeline, and you use a lot of that stuff anyway. Now, there are definitely a lot of optimizations you can do using shaders from to both optimize rendering speed, to optimize binary size. I've seen some really interesting stuff done in shaders where parts of the environment in a 3D world, like flags waving in the wind, are actually all implemented inside of a shader, and all of the data for how a flag should wave is embedded in the PNG in the alpha channel. Things like this. You can do crazy stuff like that for optimization's sake with shaders, and so it's nice to have them when you need that. But the majority of what you're going to do, especially if you're building a 2D game, is you're going to be using the standard stuff anyway. So, no, absolutely. What I said before about getting something running very quickly and testing it and playing it and making it fun, that's much more important than having access to that other stuff. So if that gets you there faster, then use that. You might end up having to switch later for whatever reason. You're running into performance issues and you just can't do what you want with the technology you're currently using. Occasionally you have to switch. But yeah, no, it's totally great to use those things. I highly recommend them. Because I come from the world of doing GL by hand, I feel a little hamstrung when I don't have them, but that doesn't mean I actually would use them anyway in a lot of cases. I don't use them when I do UIKit stuff.
Right. I wonder if we could switch the conversation a little bit and talk about some of the facilities that iOS has beyond graphics to facilitate gaming. Specifically, I'm talking about GameCenter, where you have like the matchups and the leaderboards and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, GameCenter is really amazing technology for anybody who's done leaderboards or achievements or multiplayer before the days of GameCenter. That stuff was a nightmare. I remember back in the iPhone 2.0 days, before it was even called iOS, doing a leaderboard for a game, and we had to write a PHP server, and we had to implement anti-hack and stuff. With the way that GameCenter's set up, is everybody's got accounts now, all the stuff shared across it, and access and leaderboards. Achievements is all, maybe 20, 30 lines of code to get that all set up and running. So it really saves you a lot of headache. The multiplayer stuff is really amazing too, especially the matchmaking. If there are enough people out there looking for a game, matchmaking can really add a lot to the platform, and you don't have to worry about error correction or anything like that. Turn-based multiplayer was added in iOS 5, and that really came around and added a whole new element to the multiplayer stuff, and Apple continues to kind of expand on GameCenter and add to it. A lot of people don't know that GameCenter even has a voice chat engine built into it. And anybody who's ever worked with voice over IP knows that stuff's a real nightmare to get right. So with GameCenter, you can actually get that up and running, and I think it's 4 lines of code is all you need to get that all set up. So it really makes game development a lot easier, and it adds all that stuff that people are looking to for a game. Shipping an app without a leaderboard now, or a game without a leaderboard now, is really unthinkable, and GameCenter kind of gives it to you for very, very low overhead.
I'm still surprised that so few. I haven't found any apps that I can think of off the top of my head, or games that use the voice chat feature. I think it's really cool, and it's amazing how easy it is to use. And I really don't know of anyone who's using it.
Is it only real time, or could you do like I'm trying to think, asynchronous voice? So like if I'm playing Letterpress and I'm like, oh man, check out this word or something like that, and I could record it. Is it more just real time, VoIP?
Well, it's built on top of the AV foundation kits for sound. So if you want to do kind of a delayed message, like leaving a voicemail for somebody, you wouldn't even have to go down to a level of voice chat. You would just kind of record that audio and pass it over as a part of the game data to the next player. So it's even easier than that. But, a lot of games just don't, think people are interested in real-time chat or any kind of delayed asynchronous chat, especially any turn-based games. It doesn't make sense that you can't talk to your opponent in them. It's always been kind of a pet peeve of mine that you're playing Scrabble or Letterpress or Risk with somebody on iOS using turn-based and you can't communicate with that person at all. It's really frustrating sometimes. And the technology and the tools are all given to us for like I said, very low overhead from GameCenter and GameKit to do that.
You guys talked a little bit at the beginning about that, game programming is part of the reason that you got into development in the first place. And I think that's true for a lot of developers. But when they get into actually doing work as a career, they're doing line of business web apps, something like that. But you guys actually made the switch where you're doing a lot of game development and actually doing it as part of your job, not just some night and weekend thing. Can you guys talk a little bit about how you guys made the switch to do that?
Sure, it's a hard switch to make. The problem that you have is, like you said, everybody wants to be a game developer. Everybody wants to work on games because they're perceived as very fun. You think that being a video game tester, you get to sit around and play games all day. Same thing with a game developer is you think that's kind of the world that it is. So the market's really crowded. Unfortunately, when the market's really crowded, it's hard to get a job for it. And when you can get a job for it, it's usually not as well paying as a typical development job doing databases or websites. So the problem that I had and a lot of other people had was we taught ourselves to be programmers. We went to college or school to be programmers to make games, and then very quickly we realized there's not a lot of money in it. With iOS, there can be a lot of money in it, but there's also a lot of games. And it's I like to call it kind of a lottery. You can make a really great game. I'm sure there's thousands and thousands of really amazing games out there that nobody has ever, downloaded or never really took off. So, the problem is you can put a ton of time into it and not actually make any money off it. You can spend more than a year making a game and never actually see any profit from it. Whereas if you're a consultant for somebody else, if you're, working in a cubicle job, you're getting paid for the time you're putting into it. So there's a lot of risk involved with it. As far as working professionally for a game development shop like Empirical Development, it's really good to kind of build up that portfolio. And it's kind of a catch-22 is you can't build up the portfolio if you're not, working in the career field. What you want to do is you want to, work on hobbyist programs. You want to join, some open source games that are out there. And there are plenty of games out there that are written in the open source kind of mentality. I haven't seen too many on the iOS platform, but definitely on Mac and Windows and Linux, there's a lot of, open source kind of contributed games out there. So, the trick is just do a lot of it, build up the portfolio, and more so with any other type of developer out there for game developers, it's all about your portfolio. It's what you've worked on. It's what you've done for those games. And, any developers can be looking at your portfolio, but with a gaming portfolio, it's doubly important.
Yeah, the problem with getting into the game industry per se, like as a developer at a studio, especially a bigger studio, is, they're notorious for taking advantage of the fact that you can make games there, and pretty much any kid in college wants to make a game, right? And as I'm not a kid in college anymore, so I'm not willing to spend 80-hour weeks working for virtually no pay on just kind of really gopher kind of jobs in the code base. I want to help build the game, right? And that's not what you get, especially coming out as kind of an entry level person into the video game industry. I was lucky and got steered away from that approach. Like I'm almost headed down that route when I first came out, and I got steered away from it into the middleware and tools side. And that was an interesting kind of entry into the game development industry, was working on compilers and debuggers and profilers and that kind of stuff for consoles. And that was so that's a kind of another kind of backdoor way into the industry is, and me, I'm a graphics geek. As much as I love games, I really love computer graphics, right? And so I found other ways to use my to work on graphics without working on games, which where I worked on some visualization toolkits and stuff like that. I always tried to go for gigs that were heavy on things that are important to game development, like graphics or tools and optimization and that kind of stuff. So I kind of had the foundation for actually building a game without having to suffer at the hands of Activision or EA or something. But right now, build a game. Build a game and put it out there. You're probably not going to make any money off of it, so you might as well make it free so more people see it. And that's the only way you're going to kind of break in or to actually, become part of, the best way to become a game developer is to make a game. And it doesn't really matter what it is. Just start doing it. Like I say, get to something you can build, something you can touch as quickly as possible, and then and tweak it from there. You're already a programmer, so you know how to do that. So get something you can touch as quickly as possible and start tweaking it, and eventually you'll kind of a game will pop out the other side. It just takes a lot of time and kind of dedication, and you have to really want to do it because game development is not easy. So it's getting into it is difficult because it's not easy and because it seems so cool from the outside.
I would venture a guess and say that there's not many entry-level game positions out there for iOS, and the ones that are out there, there's probably just unbelievable competition on. So, make sure you're not entry-level, work on games in your spare time. Do what a lot of us did when we were trying to get into a platform that we love is once you come home from your day job, you sit all night and you work on code that you're passionate about, and, you'll get some products out there. If you make something for yourself, then, hopefully other people will like it and you can kind of take off with them.
Yeah.
So work those nights and weekends. That's what I'm hearing. Do it yourself.
Nice.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of space for people coming in who aren't experienced with it already.
Yeah. The competition is too fierce. The budgets are too tight, and it's really hard to justify bringing someone on to get them trained up. Yep.
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily has to be like something that you shy away from because it's a crowded market or it's difficult to get into. Because for me, I was learning how to do object-oriented programming, and I was really interested in software design, and games were a way to flex those like different parts of my programming muscles and exercise things that I would normally not think about, like a game loop or running things efficiently or scene graphs or whatever, just lots of things like that. So I think there's value in just doing it as a way to advance your own sort of skills.
Yeah, it'll definitely make you a better developer. Just like learning a new programming language will make you a better developer. Anything you do that's out of your comfort zone and makes you think about things from a different angle will make you better.
The amount of optimization you need to do to get a game to run right is only going to help you, do everything else when it comes to programming.
Yeah. All right. Well, there's a party in Cupertino, so let's get to the picks. Ben, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I've got a lot, so I'm going to go really quickly. This is a game that by an indie developer who sort of just fell into immediate success. I haven't played it in a long time, but if you haven't played it, it's well worth it. It's called Trainyard by Mavericks, and he is now a full-time game developer. Another game that takes use of the GameCenter sort of local matchups is called Space Team. It's a free game, and it's hilarious. Basically, you get a screen, and the things that it's telling you to do to fix a spaceship are buttons on somebody else's iPad. So you got to shout out the instructions, and it's always like flip the goggle flinger, and he's got to look for that button or switch on his screen, and he's shouting out things to you, and it gets worse the more people there are. That's a hilarious game. Another app I've been using recently is Duolingo. I think it's a really solid iOS app, and I've been using it to learn a little bit of French. And then some other picks. I've got one of my favorite game programming books is called Game Coding Complete by Mike McShaffry. And this just sort of totally blew my mind. It's like, 1,800 pages or something. It's huge. But it goes into like how you design games and how you work with assets. And it's completely outdated at this point, but I think the concepts are still relevant. And it's just a fascinating read. And then two videos. One of them is called The Physics of Light by John Carmack. He gave this at QuakeCon earlier this year, I think. And it's just a really good talk by one of the luminaries in the game development industry. And, how games simplify the physics of light. And they can take shortcuts that make it seem real. And then lastly is another video by Bret Victor called Inventing on Principle, where he talks about some sort of innovative in-game or like in-app tools you could use to sort of get more rapid feedback on what you're building. And I don't want to spoil the punchline, but just go watch it. And those are my picks.
All right, Jaim, what are your picks?
So I have one pick. I've got a blog post I may have mentioned before, but it's overcoming iOS game memory limits. And I don't do a whole lot of game stuff, but I ran into a lot of the same type of problems doing kind of a notation engine for a music application where we're playing music and drawing parts of the screen. So drawing stuff off screen. But, memory management is a problem with a lot of apps. So I've got a blog post from Game Closure, and that's my pick.
All right. Andrew, what are your picks?
I've got 3 picks today. So the first one is the Nerd blog, which is Big Nerd Ranch's blog. And they have a lot of good technical posts, mostly about iOS development, although occasionally about other things, because I think they're sort of trying to expand to more than just iOS and Mac. Second one is a post by Craig Hockenberry on his blog this week, which was in iOS Dev Weekly and Mac Dev Weekly, but it goes through some problems with code signing in the upcoming 10.9 release, and also has a solution, and it helped me fix this very problem this week. So there's that. And then the last one is a little app that I use all the time called Cocoa Color. It's on the Mac App Store. I think it's a few bucks, and it looks terrible. The UI is really quite poor, but it's really useful, and it will generate code for NS Color, UI Color, CSS colors, NS Gradient, and that kind of thing with a UI that lets you do with color picker and all that. So it can also translate back from an NS Color call to paste that into your color picker if you want to tweak it. So it's nice. And those are my picks.
Awesome. Rod, what are your picks?
All right, got 2 picks. The first pick is actually a game that I wrote with some friends a while ago. We haven't updated it because it hasn't done well, but it's still interesting because it actually is a game that you play in the real world. So if you played like the assassination game in college, if you know what that is, it's similar. It's called Ninja Hit, and you use the camera to basically, quote, kill people, your target. So it was fun to develop. So if you want an idea of what you can do in the real world, you might check that out. And then my second pick is Joybox, which is a RubyMotion gem for writing games. It is a wrapper around Cocos 2D and Box 2D, which is a physics engine. And so it provides a higher level abstraction for writing games, and it looks like a lot of fun. And the website's pretty cool, too, so check that out. And those are my picks.
Awesome. All right, I've got a couple of picks. The first one, I'm stealing it off of the Impact.js episode that we did on JavaScript Jabber. It's opengameart.org, and it's a bunch of art that you can use in your games. In fact, I'm going to pick the Impact.js episode where we talked about it's actually a system for writing games in HTML5 Canvas and things like that. And they actually have a utility that you can use to port them over to iPhone games. I also want to pick the next episode on JavaScript Jabber where our very own Pete Hodgson came on and talked about asynchronous testing. So if you're a fan of Pete, then go pick up the latest JavaScript Jabber. And I'll get links to both of those in the show notes as well. Nathan, what are your picks?
I've got a few. First of all, there's mine are going to point towards the thing that people always seem to ask me when they get started in game development, and that's math. And math is hard, as we all know. There are some pretty good resources out there for the kind of math that you would do as a game developer. There's a really great series of posts on 2D linear algebra for game development on the Wolfire blog. It's called Linear Algebra for Game Developers, and it's a 3-parter. It's a really, really simple, straightforward introduction to vector math, and it's pretty much mostly, and I think there's a little bit of matrix stuff in there as well. But really important if you're building a game where things have to move. It's the math that you'll spend most of the time doing. Another one is also math related, and it's a book. The second edition just recently came out called the 3D Math Primer for Graphics and Game Development. You can pick that up like on Amazon or whatever, but it's the book that taught me 3D math or graphics math in general. And then another one is more general game development and not necessarily even iOS, but that's Alt Dev Blog a Day. And it's a ton of people in the game industry just it was a kind of a takeoff back in the day when we were doing iDev Blog a Day, which was a bunch of iOS indie devs just posting to their own blogs, and it kind of aggregated them all together. Well, this is the same thing, but it covers the entire game development industry. So there's a ton of people writing games out there that are also blogging about the process, whether it be game AI, physics, art, production, design, whatever they're putting on their blogs is getting aggregated to Alt Dev Blog a Day, and it's a fantastic and fascinating resource to follow. So I believe those are all my picks for now.
Awesome. Kyle, what are your picks?
So I have three all apps, surprisingly enough. The first is an app called Sleep Cycle, and since the iPhone came out, people have been trying to develop an app that can properly detect REM sleep, so it can wake you up when you're not in REM sleep. Sleep Cycle's the first one I've seen that can actually do it well. I've been using it for about a week now, and it's quite an amazing app, and it's just you check it out. Pivot is a iOS game that's fairly new. It came out a few weeks, maybe a month ago now, and it's a very simplistic type game. It's something that anybody could have written, even with very limited game programming experience, and it was just such amazing gameplay. We were talking about doing art free or low art type apps. This is a great example of what somebody can do with very limited art resources and still make a really fantastic app. And the final one is called Hungry Shark's Evolution. This is a game that my girlfriend actually got me hooked on, and you play a shark, and it evolves over time and gets bigger, and you just kind of swim around and eat fish, and it's a nice little no-thought action game.
I'd like to throw something in there about Pivot. That's a good example of someone who wasn't a game developer becoming one. Whitaker, the guy who built it, actually was doing a bunch of music for indie games and decided he wanted to build his own, and Pivot's one of the ones that came out of that. So it is possible.
Yeah, and it's doing very well too, which is always nice to see from smaller, less-known developers. And it's really just a great example of what you can do when you don't have tremendous resources behind you.
Yeah, that's really cool. And hopefully we can get a few more people to try their hand at writing games. All right, well, I don't want to take too much more time because I know you guys want to go see the Apple event, so I'm going to wrap up the show. Thanks for coming, guys.
Lot for having us. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks.
All right, well, we will catch you all next week.